number of things to show you today. Out on the table are the books that different authors would call and want pictures and would work with me to get information about the family because of the historical nature into the book. So we got Helen Pike did the Eatontown book, and Randy did Randy Gabrielin. I think he did the two Middletown books, and whatever he finds that pertains to the family, he brings to me. Evelyn Stryker Lewis did the Neptune book, and there were a number of pictures in there. I forgot who did the Asbury Park book, but anyhow, these are the two latest ones. Rick Geffen, he's really an excellent speaker, and he's dug up a lot of information about Tinton Falls and all of that. So we made it into his book, Hidden History of Monmouth and the Family Story. This I published last summer because it was Isaac's 200th birthday. He was born in 1818. So every 2 years the family has a reunion. And last year, 2018, would have been the 200th birthday. So put together a lot of pictures. I had 50 of them. I've got about one left. And this was just published by Monmouth County. You can get a copy of it out at the archives. And of course it has Mahala and Descent.
Yes.
It's 4 centuries of Monmouth County women.
It's from Archives Day
Yes,
this year.
and not, I don't think there's any cost.
No,
No, there's not.
Really?
I went out there the other day and picked up 3 because I wanted to send, this is Ristel Richardson Reevy. She married Johnson Reevy, who was born in Little Silver. And her 2 granddaughters, I thought her great-granddaughters would like to have a copy. So Gary called me, we talked, I sent him information about her. I don't know how he found her, but he found her, and he did a nice write-up, not that much information, but she was an activist and busy. So it was nice to have somebody represent the family and be honored. It will do. And I do have a handout for you at the end with some information that you might find helpful. This area really goes back to the beginning of Tinton Falls, of Monmouth, of what we know of as Shrewsbury. And you know the history about the mill and all of that. And Lewis Morris bringing in 50 or 60 slaves from Barbados to work the iron bog and all of that. And the African cemetery that's right along here on the old maps. I see you have that old map out there. And if you look closely at that, you'll see an Indian path that comes from North Jersey, cuts down across New Jersey, and comes right down here, it looks like right about to the falls, and kind of goes through Sycamore and over to Tinton and over to Oceanport. But the falls was a major place for fishing and animals, and if you read the accounts 400 years ago of the animal life that surrounded these falls, it's just really amazing the kinds of animals that lived here. When I received a research writing, a historical writing grant many years ago, and I was supposed to write the life and times of Cherokee Indian Ike, who was my grandmother's grandfather, which I did. But I ran across so much information that was interesting that it was just, you just go off in tangents of all kinds of things that you run across that are just so interesting that you never knew about. And it occurred to me that the textbooks that our kids read, it's like reading what's on the top of a pin. That's how much information is in a textbook, because they've got so much to cover. They really can't get into all the little local stories of the whole region or whatever you're doing. fourth grade used to cover New Jersey, but, you know, the Indian history that was covered is all about people who lived in the cave, the Stone Age caves. I mean, sitting around a fire and pounding with bricks or something. I mean, none of it was current or brought up to any kind of modern times. Anyhow, the Navesink has a very interesting story. It's salt water, and it provided transportation. And I belong to the Navesink River Rowing Club, so I'm out there in the morning, rowing up and down the river, and I can't help but think of my ancestors who probably also rowed up and down the river, fishing and moving things from place to place. You know, Columbus's logs, and that's where you find a lot of the source information, talked about canoes that approached his ships, and those canoes had 80 men in them. Now, that ain't the canoe that I was in. 80 people in a canoe. And the same thing along in New York, up and down the harbor. The name's Canarsie was a tribe. Gowanus, Mamaroneck.
Really? All those names.
And, you know, we have them all around here, Wanamassa, Hoboken, Weehawken, Hocoxen, Portapac. You know, we're loaded with Indian names because as the settlers bought the property, they had to use the names of the tribes that they bought the property from. So those names stuck because if there was a question about the property, you had to know who and where and what you brought the property from. Now, many of those deeds are in the archives in Trenton, in the State Department building, in the basement. They're locked in a safe, but if you want to see them, they'll dig them out for you and show you whatever you'd like. So when they say, you know, the land was stolen, well, it was, but they gave them something. They gave them blankets, hatchets, a little bit of this, a barrel of rum, things like that. So, it's the way it was. And they traveled to a different spot, moved on, all the rest of it. So I would like to just talk a little bit about 500 years along the Navesink, and then I brought some slides to show you of the family, and then I have the handout for you if you might be interested further. And excuse me for reading, I have this on PowerPoint, but I'd rather just,
Where's Mike?
not yet.
Not yet, okay.
If you close your eyes for a minute and just go back millions of years. And we're in an ice age. Actually, there were 4 ice ages. At the time, New Jersey was covered by 9,000 feet of ice. That's like a mile and a half. So, and gradually as the ice melted and came back and melted and came back, geologists say that the shoreline was 300 feet lower than it is now. If you were here at the time, you could have walked 80 miles out into the ocean, what we know as ocean. Gradually, the earth warmed. In fact, it's still warming. Semi-tropical creatures have been found. Crocodiles, dinosaurs 35 feet long have been found at Horsey Park, skeleton remains, all kinds of teeth from sharks. But this became eventually a warming trend hit the area. The water rose as it's doing now. It was a playground for seals, whales, porpoises, stingrays. In fact, in Henry Hudson's log, when they pulled into Sandy Hook in 1609, maybe, I don't know, I might have the date wrong. But anyhow, they would come ashore to get fresh water. That's one thing they needed, was water. And they found a spring near Highlands, they got their water, and as they were getting back in the ship, there were 4 rays that swam by the ship. So they grabbed them, and they took those rays on the ship and cooked them and ate them. So, not going to read it in a book, history book, but if you read the original source of information, the ship logs, you'll find out all kinds of crazy stuff. New Jersey has 125 miles of seacoast, over 100 rivers and creeks, so it made it the kind of place that settlers wanted to settle, because there was water here, and you can't live without water. The first contact, if we go back 1,000 years, of course you've got the Vikings coming over, settling, trying to make a living, trying to survive. They eventually gave up and went back home. In the 1300s, British ship records recorded trading with natives off the coast of Massachusetts. Now, even in the 1300s, the natives knew of diseases, and they knew that bad things happened when those ships came. They would die. So they figured out a way to rig up a rigging system on a rope, and they would exchange goods by that, by, what do you call it?
Like a pulley.
Pulleys, right. In the 1400s, fishing boats also record land and people. Now, this is even before Columbus discovered everybody.
He was lost after
Columbus made 4 trips. He landed in the Caribbean to different islands, and went back kind of broke and penniless and died in prison. In 1524, Verrazano, of course we've got the bridge now, saw the Delaware Bay, the coast, and described happy people dressed in bird feathers. In the 1540s, the Spanish emptied a ship of horses and hogs off the coast of Carolinas, and they came ashore, trampled the native gardens, and caused a lot of conflict because there were no pigs here. And the pigs are rooters and diggers, so they destroyed the gardens that the native people had. So, you're going to have a problem with your neighbor if the pigs are tearing up your yard, Artifacts that have been found locally have been made of sandstone, banner stone, hearths have been found, fireplaces that gave warmth, light, and protection from animals. Axes, arrowheads, scrapers, blades of copper, bone, shell, baked clay, and crushed rock, storage pots. How do we know where the villages were? Because of middens, M-I-D-D-E-N. Middens were mounds of shells, and sometimes they included bones too, but sometimes like Oyster Point in Red Bank, there was a huge midden there that was 30 feet wide, and I don't know how tall, but that's where they put their garbage. Oyster Point was the site of an old Indian settlement, and about every 8 miles there was a midden, so Fairhaven, Rumson, Navesink, Locust, Middletown, Watchung, Matawan, about a day's walking distance was a village. The earliest known inhabitants here were part of Lenape group called the Navesink, and the names were longer in those days. Lots of names, not lots of syllables added on to the names. But, the Europeans, they chop them up. Navesink, that's good. I know what you're talking about. A skeleton was found near the Hubbard Bridge, which is now called the Krillos Bridge, going across from the Middletown side to the Red Bank side. That was buried in a sitting position. Also, an axe and pestle was found at 176 Riverside Avenue when they were digging, preparing foundations, they would find things. Now, many of these artifacts are turned over to the State Museum, and they have a huge collection of items there and they have an excellent exhibit on the Lenape, and the Sandhill people are included in that. So if you ever get over there sometime, it's worth the trip. The original people were the Lenape, and they were governed by a sachem, who was a spiritual leader or chief. There were 3 clans: the Unami, the Turtle Clan, the Unalato was the Turkey Clan, and the Minsi, which was the Wolf Clan. And in the area were the Navasinks, the Assapinks, the Matawans, the Shackamazons, the Cheesequakes, the Raratans, the Nanticokes, and the Hackensackis. And you know, we've got tribes like Connecticut, Massachusetts,
Yep.
Kentucky, Utah, Dakota. The names are still there. And we've kind of absorbed it into American English, and we think, oh, well, you know, those were tribes. Those were the people, named after the people that lived there. The Indians were woodland people. They did not live in teepees. And I've had people come up and ask me,
Yep.
do you live in a teepee? No,
No.
don't live in
No.
a teepee. Another whole group of people. In fact, the federal government recognizes 500 and almost 70 different tribes. Now, some are recognized by federal and state. Some are recognized just by state and not federal. Some are not recognized at all. New Jersey has 4 groups: the Nanticoke, the Powhatan, the Ramapo, and the Intertribal, which is people like us that are
Mixed up with
kind of
everything.
float around. Been here, but we never got formally recognized. I don't think it mattered to the Sandhill people. Everybody knew them here, and I think they were just, it wasn't a big thing. It just, they had their businesses, they worked, they were prosperous, and they knew who they were, and I didn't think they found the need to get a European government to recognize them for something they already were. I was like, well,
Yep.
whatever. But the area included marshes, mudflats, sheltered estuaries, meadows, bays, coves, forests, uplands full of abundance. And the European settlers were in awe of the abundance of food that was here. They did not want to return home. If you read the letters that were sent back to Holland, England, wherever they were from, they all talk about how their cellars were full of food. Because food is one thing they didn't have a lot of in Europe, mainly because they had been farming for a couple thousand years, and after a point, the soil is worn out. So they weren't allowed to hunt on the king's lands, and if they did, they'd be arrested. They had very little luck with the farming. They had very bad teeth because they had very bad nutrition. And here, the Indians had very good teeth. They had very good skin. They were tall and slender. They had a diet of no sugar and no salt.
A little fast.
Right, and just natural foods. So this kind of amazed the Europeans, that the Indians were in such good physical condition. There was an abundance of seafood here: oysters, clams, scallops, lobsters, crab, cod, eel, bass. Alewife was like, they think it's an Indian word, alewife, and it's a little silvery fish. I think it sounds to me like a sardine kind of thing. Flounder, bluefish were abundant, food source. And deer, fox, rabbit, apple, pear, succulents, blackberries, plums, sassafras, blueberries, huckleberries, strawberries, grapes, artichokes, cattail shoots, beach plums, currants, leeks, and rose hips. The forests were full of 330 species of different birds, ducks, geese, 40-pound wild turkeys. Try putting that in your oven. Bones have been found that belong to elk, deer, bear, lynx, dog, raccoon, hare, woodchuck, skunk, squirrel, turtle, snake, and sharks. Also sturgeon and an ancient form of elephant, mammoth, mastodon, giant beaver, sloth, caribou, musk ox, and moose. We don't think of it as being part of our environment, but it was. Also chestnut, acorns, corn, hominy grits, hawthorn plums, brown cherries, and seeds. The living conditions in the villages consisted of a big house, which was a ceremonial gathering place. All the villages had a place for people to gather and sing and dance and pray and commune with each other. In this area, they also had longhouses, which we would call like a condo. There were several families living there, 5 or 6 families. The forests were pine and oak, hemlock and chestnut, and also wigwams. There was a wigwam right here on what we would call Tinton Avenue, and in it lived an Indian named Indian Will. And every morning he walked to Thomas Eaton's house, who lived right on Wampum Brook, right there in Eatontown, and he had breakfast with him, and he ate with a silver spoon. The wigwams were like a little tent covered with bark, enough for 1 or 2 people. The smoke escaped through the top of the roof. And cooking was done in large pots of soapstone, and they usually had a stew, a meat, cooking all day long. Also mollusks were very high in protein and very low in calories. Everything they ate was nutritious. They had gardens of maize, beans, squash, pumpkin, potatoes, 500 different kinds of potatoes, shipped over to Europe and Africa and used to feed their people and especially their animals. The animals eat corn in Africa, which comes from the New World. We eat corn here, but the Europeans are like, how can you eat corn? Animals eat corn, but they don't know corn like we know corn.
That's right. Sweet corn, Jersey sweet corn.
But corn saved Europe and Africa, and corn is still saving them. And soybeans is another nutritious food substance that goes from here to China and all around the world. And we grow millions of tons of soybeans. Okay, wampum. I want to talk a little bit about wampum. Wampum, when I think of wampum, I think of something like bitcoins. It's something that can be used for money. You agree?
Yes.
And it was used here by the Dutch especially. Wampum were shells, and the shells of different colors had different values. The darker the shell, the purple shells, had more value than the lighter shells. And they were strung into beads, and then those beads had an equivalency. It was so many shells equal, say, $1. So the Dutch used them. The Dutch were able to trade. The natives would come to trading posts in New York, New Amsterdam, up and down the rivers, trade things. They'd pay them in wampum or trade different items, and it worked. When the English took over, they canceled all the wampum. They said, oh no, it's not going to work. But the wampum was even used to pay rent back in Holland. And also beaver pelts were used to pay rent, and beaver pelts were extremely valuable. One beaver pelt could pay a month's rent in Holland. So you can see how the beaver were completely wiped out because of the pelt trade that went back to Europe. You could also ride the ferry across the river from Manhattan to New Jersey in 1679 and pay with wampum. Okay, a little bit about the triangle trade. Native people made the wampum, signed a treaty in 1656 with Peter Stuyvesant and Tuckapushka. They exchanged with the Dutch for trade goods, fish hooks, axes, knives, spoons, steel pannon. Steel pannon was what we would call a skillet. A steel pannon, steel pan in Dutch. Liquor, they trade for liquor. These trading posts were like a bank. The Dutch kind of kept them so that you could have a safe place to come and trade your goods. The Dutch bought furs from all the northern tribes who then gave up farming to go find pelts. So if you give up your farming, you've given up what keeps you alive and what sustains your community. They shipped and sold the furs, whale oil, and tobacco to European markets. Would take that back to Africa, pick up enslaved people, bring them to the Caribbean and North America, pick up rum on the way, take that back. It was just a whole triangle of networking of the triangle trade. Women did the gardening, planted the gardens, gathered greens for salad, cared for crops, did the food preparation, dried the meat and fish, took care of the children, passed on traditions, manufactured and cared for clothing and pottery and textiles. They were busy. Men trapped and hunted and did the heavy butchering, tool making, fished, educated youth, and protected the village. So when the Europeans tried to force the native people, the men, into farming and gardening, it was like against their bodies. They're just against their whole cultural traditions, because the women did the gardening, not the men. There was very little authority in most villages. People were equal. Women were equal to men. They were extraordinarily charitable. They shared with each other. Nobody went without. Everybody shared their goods. And when I think about my grandmother's people, when they left Eatontown, they bought 15 acres in what was called Ocean at the time. And as the children were married and set up their own families, property was divided, houses were built, but they had their communal things, like they all had one corn crib, so that corn crib held the corn for the whole village. They had a barn, everybody used the barn. They had a smokehouse, everybody used the smokehouse. They didn't have their individual things like we have now. We have our own everything. We're just so individualistic that it's like, you don't have it? Too bad for you. But they didn't live that way. They lived as a community, and they looked out for each other. Okay, there are about 800 deeds selling off the land in New Jersey. And now I would like to show you some pictures of the family that lived here in Eatontown, Tinton Falls. And you know, when I was researching the property, the deeds, I was finding all these strips of property all through Eatontown and along where 36 cuts from the parkway and goes into Eatontown. All through there were just strips of property like 50 feet long, maybe 10 feet wide, 100 feet long, 10 feet wide. And it's like, why would you have all these strips of property? Well, they used them for lumber because they were builders. So they would get the lumber they needed, let it grow back, and they always had lumber for whatever they needed. Now, all the items that you see here were in the Neptune Museum. And maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the town of Neptune decided to enlarge their library. So they closed it, and we petitioned to get our family items back. But along with those goods was my grandmother's grandfather's, Isaac, right here, his account book. And somebody had the forethought to donate that account book to the museum. So it starts in 1855, and it's a record of where he worked, what he did, what he built, what he paid, who he hired, who hired him, how much he paid a day, or was paid a day, usually about $2.50, which for 200 years ago was quite a bit of money, skilled labor. And that was invaluable because it gave me a picture of life 200 years ago in a person's life. He also built a school on Wall Street, and the deed was right there in the Monmouth County books, a school for colored children. So from what I can figure out, to me it looks like it's under Eatontown Circle now, because Wall Street came where it is now, right through Eatontown Circle over to like South Street, right by that Locust Grove Cemetery where some of his siblings are buried. And right along Wall Street is also that White Ridge Cemetery, and there's a great big Revey, R-E-V-E-Y, monument in there. Now, there's another family named Revey, R-E-E-V-E-Y, that's different family than this Revey family, the Native American family. But people will say, oh, I'm a Revey, but you got to trace back to the origins of that name. There's also another family off of Squonkam, another cemetery off of Squonkam Road, which is, I think it used to be called Shadow Rest. I'm not exactly sure what the current name is, but that cemetery has a lot of Civil War dead in it, and also Elizabeth's mother and father, Richard P. Revey and Suzanne. And I happened to have on News 12 one time years ago, and they were showing a Boy Scout and Eagle Scouts project. And he had gone in there and cleaned up that cemetery, and the photographer zoomed right in on Richard P. Revey's headstone just as I happened to look at the TV. I almost fell off the chair because I had been told that there were family members back there in that cemetery. But, some things you just never get around to doing. But I got over there and took pictures, and last year at the family reunion, we took 4 carloads of cousins over there so that they could also see. And also back in there is a large family called Ruffins. Now, I never heard of the Ruffins, but there must have been millions of them because that is a big cemetery. But anyhow, it's right off Squonkam Road, and every now and then people clean it up, and we kind of keep Mount Prospect cleaned up because that's where Isaac and all 5 generations of my family are buried, right behind the Jersey Shore Hospital. And the Red Bank, there's another group that takes care of that White Ridge Cemetery. They keep that maintained. There's one up here right behind St. Leo's, an African American cemetery. That's about 2 acres. And Rick Geffen and a crew have been up there keeping that maintained and cut down. And so anyhow, I'd like to show you a few pictures of the family, and before my time runs out. Years I presented at the New Jersey Education Association convention a couple of years, and this was the card that they made up for the table. So I asked them if I could have it, and they said yes. If they didn't say I could have it, I was going to swipe it. So anyhow, they gave it to me. And I thought it's a slice of our Shore history. And wherever I go, I try to get families to think about preserving their own family story, because you have an interesting story too. And if you saved it and you started researching, which is much easier nowadays than it was when I was putting all this together, just think of the bits of information and the interesting story that you could write about your forefathers, and how much you would learn about them, and how much you could pass down to the next generation. So think about that, because it's a fun topic, and it's all part of the mosaic of America. This is my grandmother right in the middle, Adeline, and her sisters and cousins, first cousins, her brothers and cousins in the back, and they were all Richardsons and Reeves. The two families, according to Monmouth County records, there are about over a dozen marriages between the two families. So they were so intermarried, and then they all named their children after each other. So, talk about confusing. I mean, you might have 17 Isaacs, 17 Isaac Richardsons. So you kind of have to put the dates together and figure out which one you're talking about. And it's the same thing with Lewis Morris. Now, we all know Lewis Morris right here at the mill, but there are 5 or 6 Lewis Morrises, and they're all related. So when you're talking about Lewis Morris, you have to know which one, from what decade, what century you're talking about, because they all had the same name. This was a gathering at the New Jersey World's Fair 1939 in Trenton. That's Rias Crummell in the middle. That's Tay's great-grandfather. Her friend is here. She's showing me some of her pictures. And my grandmother's 3 brothers right in the middle. And then 2 Reeves. Jim Reeve, Jim Lone Bear Reeve, was the head of the New Jersey Indian Office in Orange, and his father, Robert Reeve. Now, Robert Reeve is the son of Restell, and I showed you Restell's picture at the beginning in that book. That's her son, Robert, all the way on the right. And that's her grandson, James. And these are cousins. Edmonia on the left had a house right here on Shaft Hill Road years ago. Her sister, Marguerite, and another sister, Alma. Their descendants still live around the area and are still part of the cousins and activities. This was the Richardson firehouse, fire wagon. They had a fire company called Eureka. And this happened to be a postcard, and on the postcard it tells you the name of the 2 horses, Dolly and somebody, and also the dog. The dog was with them. This is my grandmother's brother Charles, and this was, the firehouse was on Asbury, on what we would call Lake Avenue now, West Lake, which was called Springwood then, but it's next door to a church, Amity Church, and this was a barn where they kept that wagon. So, you know, you had to be self-sufficient, you had to be ready. There was no pick up the phone and call the fire department if you needed it. You had to be ready to save your own hide in case you needed to.
What town was that?
This was in Asbury Park. The 15 acres that they bought from James Bradley is about a mile out of Asbury Park. At one time, it was called West Park. And it's right behind the Neptune High School and the Jersey Shore Medical Center. And right behind that is a hill that was called Sand Hill. That's where the 15 acres were that my great-grandfather and his brothers owned. And back in those days, I mean, that was just all country and farms and all of that. So this fire wagon was in Asbury Park. They're just down the street, maybe a half mile. But I think they moved from Eatontown to West Park because at the time, Asbury Park and Ocean Grove were just going. They were just getting going, like in the 1870s. And this was like Atlantic City back in those days. So there was so much building to be done. There were so many houses, hotels, churches, all kinds of things to build. I just think that there was just so much work there, they just moved there rather than come back and forth by wagon every day. So I think that's how they happened to move down there.
Well, around what year did that be?
Probably maybe 1890s maybe. I don't know for sure. There might be a date on the postcard, which I don't even know.
1890.
1890. Yeah, my memory is not quite what it used to be. And that's my grandmother, Adeline, who was named after her mother, Jenny Gibson, had been born in Savannah. She was a little girl in 1852, and when she was about 8 or 9, the war broke out. So her father, Robert Gibson, decided to bring her north to an uncle who lived in Buffalo, New York. And she lived there during the war. He was killed. He was a member of that 54th Massachusetts colored troops. He was killed in 1864. And so my great-grandmother lived with her aunt and uncle, and his name was Elijah Gibson, and his wife's name was Adeline, and that was my grandmother's name. So she named her first daughter Adeline. And you know, when I looked at the Gibson family, now here's the northern Gibson family who were members of the Army and the infantry and all of that, and I looked at Robert Gibson's family in Savannah. They were all members of the Confederate Army. So you've got family fighting family and killing each other. So, and I'm sure our family wasn't the only one. I mean, 600,000 people lost their lives in that war. But that was my grandmother, who baked every day. You know, there was no going to ShopRite and getting what you need. This was, you want it, you better make it, like a pie or biscuits or cakes, or every day she did something different. And, you know, these stoves were not turned into 350. It was put some wood in it, get the temperature up, and, but they got it done. This is Mount Prospect, which is in back of Jersey Shore Medical. This is where 5 generations of my family are buried. And every Memorial Day, cousins assemble, and we maintain and cut and trim and plant and pass the tradition along. This was an exhibit at Ellis Island. A few years ago, the Dutch king, queen, somebody was there, and we were invited to participate in the ceremonies because they were celebrating 400 years of New Amsterdam. Because remember, this was New Belgium. This was New Netherlands before it was New Jersey. So there's a lot of Dutch around here, a lot of Dutch heritage. So anyhow, this was our display case. These items belong to Jim Reevy, Lone Bear, and the items that I have out on the counter belong to Isaac, the grandson, and Robert and the beading, I'm not sure who, but it belonged to the family. And these are cousins. In fact, Restelle that I showed you in the women's book, those are her two great-granddaughters right there, Carol in the blue and Suzanne in the next to her, and her children, and my brother Fortune and myself. So we met up at Ellis Island, and you should go sometime. They've really done a miraculous job with that museum. It's just really great. And you don't have to go into New York now to get there. Years ago, when we used to take the kids to the Statue of Liberty, you go all the way up over the bridge, down through the tunnel, finally get to New York, take the boat back over to New Jersey. Now you just go right to Liberty State Park, you get on the ferry, and you're there in 5 minutes. And you can go to Ellis Island and Statue of Liberty and Battery Park, and they've made it nice and they've made it convenient. This is the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs. And next year, we're working with New Jersey Historical Commission. It'll be the year of the Native American. So there are going to be a lot of events and activities that I hope you'll hear about and will come to and participate in and join the fun. This is a sister. This is one of my great-grandfather's sisters named Elizabeth. And I get a kick out of the clothing because it reminds me of Downton Abbey. And the hats. I mean, the hats were, wow, where are you going in that? But I mean, they dressed up, and I have a lot more pictures too, but they tell me usually I have about 30 minutes, so I have to cut them down. That's Elizabeth. This was from a chalk drawing that one of the cousins made, and I took a picture of it. She was born in Manhattan, 26. And just recently, one of Rick Geffen's researchers found her grandmother's death records in publication, and he sent them to me. They lived on 6 Lake Street, which is down below Canal Street, just a little below Canal Street. And when we were kids, my aunt would tell us stories about how our family had a farm in Manhattan. They had chickens and cows, and like, really, in Manhattan? What? So, but 200 years ago, Manhattan was a whole different place than it is now. So, the time went by. The grandmother died in 1842, and at the time, her parents, Richard P. Reevy and Suzanne, were married. Those are the ones that live over here, are buried over here off Squonkam Road. And she was a little girl. So, she was about 14 or 16 or so, because she married Isaac a couple of years later. So I think the family house was sold. My aunt said that an American Express company bought it. And I'm like, American Express? How am I going to find that? American Express, they must have 100 offices in New York. So anyhow, I'm on the Google machine, and I'm looking all around, and I come across the 6th Lake Street, and I'm reading all about how the Holland Tunnel, when they were putting in the Holland Tunnel, they needed a ramp. They needed space to bring the cars out. And they went right through 6th Lake Street and a couple of other houses. So the address is still there, but the house is gone. But anyhow, I was glad to find it. And also, you can, if you get on Google Earth, you can kind of just like hover over places. You can go up and down streets. You can see buildings. You can turn. It's like being in a helicopter, your own little helicopter. So on one of the walls, there was an American Express emblem. So when the Holland Tunnel took that property, American Express put an emblem there because they had bought the property. and that was still there today. And I almost fell out of the chair, because that's what my aunt said. American Express bought the property, and then Holland Tunnel took it from them. So anyhow, but you never know what you'll find. This was the homestead house. It's still there on what we would call Lake Avenue, Westlake Avenue. Used to be called Springwood. And the 15 acres stretched down what we would call Neptune Boulevard now, what was called Springdale at the time. Now, there were 2 springs on this property. That's why they named Springdale and Springwood. And they were able to pipe that water to the back porch. And they had one of those pumper things pumped into the barrel. So they always had fresh water. And we played there as kids. That's where the family had their reunions and powwows. And there was a flock of geese that lived on that lane that gave us a run for our money every day. They were wicked.
They must have attracted their cousins from Canada.
Ancestors still on. Yes.
This is a picture one of the cousins found. That's Isaac W. Richardson right in the middle. He worked at a store, at a business in Asbury Park called Glence's, and they did carvings for fireplaces, windows, mirrors. You know, it was none of this made in China, ship it over here. It was, you needed it, you had it made. And he was a master carver, a master builder. So I was always
What's
happy.
the name of the building?
Well, the business was called Glence's,
With the B?
G-L.
Oh, GL.
Glence's, but I've looked for it and I haven't found it, so. I've looked in the Asbury Park business directories of 1890, 1900, 1910, but, and he's listed, and just about everybody is listed in these directories, even women are listed. My grandmother is listed, but nothing by her name. Now, her sister Edith is listed, and by her name it says seamstress. So I guess if you wanted something done, you looked in that business directory, you found the person who did that skill, and you knew who they were and where they were. This was a family reunion in 1953, right on Springwood Avenue, on the porch. Cousins and families, kind of right there in the middle, my sister and brother and cousins. And, you know, that generation kind of moved on, and now we're the old folks. And you say, how'd we get here? This house belonged to my grandfather's brother, great-grandfather's brother, Theodore. And they built these houses. These houses were pretty neat. They had front staircases, back staircases, porches up top, decks. Lightning hit this house a couple of times. Lightning hit the tree. And this was a painting that one of the cousins had donated to the library, to the Neptune Library. So I was able to get that back, and then I gave it to my cousins who was their great-grandfather.
Where was that located?
That was located right on West Lake Avenue, right on the top of Sand Hill. It's gone now, though. This was Christina, my grandmother's cousin, first cousin. Now, her outfit was one of the ones that was in the Neptune Museum, and her granddaughter, Anita Clark, was able to get that back. So she has her dress and her outfit. Christina was a music teacher and an organist, and she taught many children piano, and she even played with the Count Basie band in the summer. Because, you know, Asbury Park was, very popular resort, the decades to Asbury Park. they didn't really have the parkway until like late fifties. So people came down, Asbury Park was a good little spot, and they stayed, and as soon as the parkway went in, right down, right past.
But I'm sitting.
That's Isaac Reeve Richardson, born in 1818, the father of the 8 children. And his account book opened a whole picture of his world.